Hey, so you're about to listen to a podcast with Daniel Newman. It cuts out a few times. If it's a little awkward, please forgive us. We're dealing with internet issues, but I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome to the Matbakh podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on this series, we welcome back Daniel Newman, who is a professor of Arabic at the University of Durham. He has been on the series being interviewed by Salma Siri. This time we have him back on the series to discuss the Exiles cookbook. He's also written The Sultan's Feast, as well as The Sultan's Sex Potions. Daniel, welcome back to afikra.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mikey, for having me again.
Okay, so here's a question for you. Real quick. I'm curious, where do you get your ideas for your publications? Where do you happen upon these ideas? How do you choose what topics to focus on? Who to sort of accompany on these, which writers to translate and accompany on these journeys that you go on when you publish these books?
Well, that's very, I can give a very simple answer to that. Interest and a passion for the subject. So before that, I've also worked on 19th century Arabic travel literature, and so I did a translation and study of Rifat Tahtawi's book Takhlis al-Ibriz. And so it's really out of interest and a passion for the subject. So in a way, you could say that I don't choose the subject, but the subjects choose me.
Before choosing these topics, were you always interested in, did you always have a scholastic interest in food? Was that something that sort of occupied a huge amount of your brain space, and you just figured out a way to have it overlap with your academic interest in Arabic?
That's an interesting one. I've always had an interest in food. So even in childhood, when traveling, I always had an interest in food as an expression of cultural identity and society. And in addition, I also consider myself a bit of a gourmet, a gastronome. But the two combined, in fact, when I was researching Islamic medicine. And of course, in Islamic medicine, particularly aphrodisiacs and the such, food plays a central role because the medical framework at the time, the so-called humoral system, of course, is inextricably linked to food. Food is what gives us balance in the body, health. And food is also what causes imbalances, which, of course, mean that we are then suffering from numerous ailments, which we then have to rectify. We have to restore the balance by eating the right food for us. And this is something that is very popular today. But the more you delve into history, the more you realize that what we think of today as being very revolutionary, in fact, has been around for a very long time. And so it was very much a question of the individual's temperament, the individual's situation, where they were living in a hot climate, cold climate, whether they were young, old, which season of the year they were in, whether they were physically active. All of these things actually were important in terms of what kind of food best agreed with them.
Yeah. Do you when you let's take the Exiles cookbook as an example. Do you remember the first time you came across this manuscript and this author?
Yes. Well, the author, that's easily almost 20 years ago at least. Because there was an edition, an Arabic edition, that came out, and also the author was referred to in other studies. That's, and then my relationship with the author got closer, if you will, when I started to recreate medieval dishes. And so I took a number of dishes from that existing Arabic edition. And then while I was working on the Sultan's Feast, I identified another copy. So the edition was based on two manuscripts, sorry. One that was from Spain, and the other one that was in Germany. Although the manuscript itself came from Syria. And so during my research for the Sultan's Feast, which is an Egyptian cookery book from the 15th century, I identified a third copy of this particular manuscript by Al-Tujibi, which is held in the British Library. And in fact, in the Sultan's Feast, I referred to that manuscript. I think I was the first to report on it, on that particular one. And so when I started looking at the manuscript, it turned out that there were a number of recipes that were missing from the other two manuscripts. And so I thought that was a wonderful opportunity to bring this very important book to a broader audience, a non-Arabic speaking audience. So that's basically, and very briefly, the genesis and development of that project.
Okay, let's talk about his full name. I think is Ibn Razin al-Tujibi, right?
Ibn Razin al-Tujibi.
Razin. Okay, so Ibn Razin al-Tujibi. Do you think this guy had any idea that 800 years later, somebody would be reading and still interested in his work? Was he self-aware enough to understand, I'm creating enough scholarship that I'm creating it so that generations 800 years later will read this?
He would have been both incredulous and mightily chuffed that that we would be talking about him. And he would be chuffed, not in the kind of obvious way of, oh my God, I'm so important that 800 years later people are talking about me, but because the book really was compiled for posterity. This is a man who was in exile, which is why I called the translation the Exiles cookbook, who had left his native Spain, the native al-Andalus. He came from Murcia, which was then, of course, swept up by the Christian armies that were pushing ever southward. And so he left al-Andalus and found his way eventually to Tunis. And here we have somebody who is really trying to preserve his heritage, the heritage of a country that he loved very dearly, and that, of course, he never saw again. He left when he was still a very young man. And eventually, as he settled, going by way of Morocco and present-day Algeria, eventually settled in Tunis, where he also died. And from the very start in the book, he speaks, of course, very highly of Andalusians and Andalusian food. So it really is a book. It's a recipe collection, but more than anything else, it's a book that tries to preserve what he believed, rightly so, to my mind, the very important Andalusian legacy in food. He would have been very surprised because culinary manuals, of course, were not considered to be high literature.
Did he think of himself as a scholar?
Well, he was a scholar, but perhaps he didn't think of himself as a culinary scholar because that very concept would have been alien to him. He was a scholar. He was a religious scholar. He was a teacher. And it is striking, therefore, that it's his culinary work that has brought him fame, if you will. And he's one of those people, of course, that we have often in history. They gain some fame locally for a particular period, but then their names are largely forgotten. And even his has only recently resurfaced, if you will. And what is interesting is that his book coexists with another Andalusian cookery book. And so we actually have two Andalusian recipe collections, both of them from the same period, the 13th century. So we're very well informed about that tradition. There are numerous overlaps between the two. And that's another interesting part of working with this kind of literature. There's a lot of sleuthing that one has to engage in. Where do these recipes come from is kind of the first question. And of course, you have a book that was written in the same period, which is anonymous. And as I said, there are numerous overlaps, but of course, the first question then arises, who copied from whom, if it was really copying?
Yeah.
And so there are, in fact, that would be the easy solution. The Andalusian, the anonymous one, presumably predates Al-Tujibi's. On the other hand, that doesn't necessarily mean that it served as the source for Al-Tujibi, because one can imagine that both of them dipped into a common source, an earlier source, maybe a tradition of multiple recipe collections that were circulating in Al-Andalus. It's very common in a kind of culinary tradition. And so the author simply cherry-picking recipes and often taking the same ones. So there's a number of possibilities. Maybe they even both took from an earlier cookery book, or even a contemporaneous one, but a third author. The other things that one looks for, of course, are references, historical references. And so we find, for instance, that in the Tujibi's book, it's roughly between the 9th and the 12th century. So references to individuals. Once again, of course, one has to be very careful with kind of over-interpreting that. But this is the data that we have. The anonymous one, though it is probably from slightly earlier than Tujibi's work, has references that go up to the 13th century. Tujibi died in 1293, so he lived through the 13th century, and also has references to characters, rulers, for instance, going back to the 8th century, so to Umayyad times.
So for the listeners, we just had a quick cut in the internet, so I'm going to jump in with a new question, which is, you mentioned that he is in exile. So can you give us a little ideas about when he left Andalusia and why Tunis, and if he thought that was a one-way street, if he thought that was a one-way ticket, and how dissimilar in culture were those two places?
He left, as I said, when he was a young man. So we're in the 1240s. And so he essentially, when the Christian armies were pushing downwards and the various cities fell one by one, there were a number of possibilities, a number of options open to everybody. One was to fight. One was to stay and try to make the best of it. And the third option, which was taken up by quite a few people, was, of course, to leave. Now, even within the third option, there were a number of possibilities. You could either go to another area that was still held by the Muslims, or you could go further down and leave the country. And of course, as things turned out, the best solution, at least so it seemed to Ibn Razin, was to leave al-Andalus altogether. So there was a huge movement of people going south, crossing the Strait of Gibraltar. Those who stayed, of course, were initially encouraged to, as I said, make the best of it. And so the Christian conquerors at first allowed them to more or less continue their existence. But of course, that would change very soon. And of course, over the years, over the decades, and over the centuries, things were tightened considerably until at one point, of course, it was convert or die. But for some time, they were allowed more or less to continue. But so Tujibi and many like him didn't stay, and so he left Murcia. He came from the Tujibi, actually is the name of a tribe, and at one point they held a number of cities. As you know, the situation in al-Andalus often politically very, very confusing and confused, with all these city-states and so on, these Tawa'if. And so the first stop is Morocco. And of course, Morocco, at the time, the culture would have been very similar. Let's not forget that the people that the Arabs and the Berbers, because the Arabs actually were in a minority in al-Andalus, the Berbers, of course, came from Morocco. So there were a number of similarities. The language was also very similar. Andalusian Arabic would have been very similar to Moroccan Arabic. And so he settles in Ceuta, and he finds this is a very intellectually stimulating environment. And so he continues his training, particularly in the religious sciences. And he traveled with some members of his family, his uncle, most notably. But then after a couple of years, he decides that it's time to fly the nest, if you will, and he decamps to Bijaya in Algeria, where he also stays for a while, and then finally heads to Tunis. Now, the decision to go to Tunis, one can imagine, wasn't really that unusual. It wasn't, woke up one day, I've heard that there's a town called Tunis, let me go there. Because Tunis actually was then the seat of the Hafsid dynasty, which is still fairly recent. And so the court there would offer opportunities for employment for a young man such as our friend Ibn Razin. So it was a very conscious decision, one can imagine. And so he would have done some teaching, but things didn't really work out the way he anticipated. And there are a few records of people meeting him later on in life, and they find a man who was living in abject poverty. And so one can imagine that as he was nearing the end of his life, his thoughts, as anybody's would be in those circumstances, would have gone back to his beloved Al-Andalus. And of course, food is one of the things that gives us solace when we're abroad, when we're sad, when we're far away from our family. And it's food, of course, whether or not it's post Madeleine, or the bread pudding that our mother used to make when we were coming home from school. It's those things, of course, that we think of, and that Al-Tujibi thought was important enough to write down and to record.
Super interesting. Let's talk about let's get into some of the recipes. Was there a first recipe that you came across that sort of blew your socks off, that you thought, wow, this is so different than some of the other work that I've come across, whether it's in the Sultan's Feast or other stuff that you had seen, that you thought, wow, this is uniquely medieval and uniquely Andalusian?
That's a difficult one, because I've recreated so many of the dishes now that there is definitely a medieval flavor. And the medieval flavor is a combination of particular ingredients. The one that comes to mind actually is vinegar, and particular spice patterns that we.
So let me give you an example, Daniel. I want you to. I want to, because you're sort of like, you're leading me into one specific dish. So on your Instagram account, medieval_Arab_cooking, you've uploaded many recreations, one of which is the medieval North African leg of lamb. Okay. I want to ask, what about this is medieval? Why isn't it just the North African leg of lamb? Or rather, why isn't it just the leg of lamb? What makes it medieval and what makes it North African or Andalusian?
Okay. There, from the word go, the word that comes to mind is eggs. Eggs, if you were to ask me, give me one ingredient that would tell you that the dish is probably Andalusian, I would say eggs. And eggs in a number of ways. One is the usual way of adding eggs and egg yolks, but they would have sometimes multiple layers of eggs. And that particular recipe, of course, you have this crusting. So they would put often on dishes a layer of eggs, often mixed with spices, with breadcrumbs as well. And so that one, I would say eggs definitely makes that an Andalusian dish. It's impossible almost for an Andalusian to make anything that doesn't also contain eggs. There's always room in the recipe for some eggs.
So talk to me about the vinegar. You mentioned vinegar before. In that dish, for example, it features fig vinegar. What are some of the other variations that of vinegar that make that feature across different recipes?
And again, an excellent question, which leads us to al-Andalus. All the roads lead to al-Andalus now. In the medieval Arab culinary tradition in general, the vinegar that one encounters is, of course, wine vinegar. Wine vinegar, which was in fact halal because there's no fermentation, so it's not alcoholic. But so wine vinegar, definitely in the Eastern manuals, mushlik. In Tujibi's book, we have a wonderful insight into the variety of vinegars that were available. And this is something that I was very, very interested in. I'll tell you why. I love the medieval flavors, but one that over the years I found a little bit jarring occasionally was vinegar. And one of the most famous dishes in the Middle Ages is a dish known as a sigbaj. A sigbaj, from the Persian words vinegar and stew, which was already made in Abbasid times. It was a dish that Ibrahim bin al-Mahdi, the half-brother of Harun al-Rashid, was particularly enamored with, and a very famous variety was made by his slave girl Bida. And I have to say that this vinegar flavor, as I said, was jarring, and particularly in a dish like that. And I just couldn't understand how this vinegary flavor, how that would have been so appealing to them. Now, I can understand in some dishes. And Al-Tujibi actually, so many years later, fast forward a number of years, gave me the answer. And it's an answer that once I saw the solution to that mystery, it was so obvious that I just couldn't understand that I hadn't noticed it before. I was always under the impression that everybody would have used the same kind of vinegar. There was one vinegar that everybody used. In fact, from Al-Tujibi's manual, I think we can safely deduce that, well, one, he has a number of different vinegars. There's fig vinegar, lime vinegar, date vinegar, all different types of vinegar. And so they would have used, just like today, they probably would have used different types of vinegar for different types of dishes. And once I discovered these vinegars, and I made a few, it turned out that once I started using them, started experimenting with these vinegars, it really resulted in a very pleasant flavor. And so once again, the cookery books, of course, wouldn't have given that information because they were written primarily for people who were doing the cooking. And so they would have known, just like today, a chef would know if I say, cook this particular dish and put vinegar in, a chef would know which kind of vinegar to use. And so it was no different really with them. So that's actually an example of, and it's an example of many where actually my recreations have been very useful to researching the recipes, because it has allowed me really to understand the mechanisms and understand the flavor patterns of the medieval tradition.
So I want to switch to the other side of the sort of flavor spectrum. I want to talk to you about desserts. I also saw that you uploaded this very interesting dessert, the medieval Tuniso-Andalusian jar cake, okay? Which to me looks like a very wasteful process. Having to break the jar every time you want to eat the cake. How many jars could one person possibly have? So tell us a little bit about this recipe and this idea of, baking a cake in a jar that you need to break later. So tell us a little bit about this.
Yes, this it's a fun recipe, and it took quite a while. I wanted to make it for a very long time, but for reasons that you've just hinted at, finding a jar that would suit the purpose and that one wouldn't mind breaking proved to be a little bit more difficult and challenging than I thought initially. So it's a cake and a sponge, and it actually tells us a lot about the cuisine, not just Andalusian cuisine, but the medieval Arab cuisine, where cooks were really supposed to show, just like today, how proficient they were. And this extended also to presentation. We have references to how they would color dishes, the various effects, making a dish look like another one, making a vegetarian dish look like a meat dish, making an eggless omelet to fool the diner. And so the jar cake is a wonderful example of that, where you can imagine the wow effect that would have produced. And one can imagine that they probably would have had all kinds of jars that they would have been able to use in order to produce the nicest effect. The other aspect of that, so one is presentation proficiency. Relating to the proficiency, even making these dishes, recreating these dishes with modern technology, which in the kitchen, I have to state very emphatically, is kept to a minimum. So there's no food processor that comes near the recreation. So it's all mortar and pestle, elbow grease. But of course, the oven is a modern oven. And once you start recreating these dishes, and that one is a good example, of course, it's very difficult to get a result that looks nice and is also flavorsome. And so you have to imagine that they are doing this in ovens that don't have a button, where the way to regulate heat is to move something closer or farther away from the flames, is nothing short of spectacular. If only one of those chefs had written a very practical cookery book, like if you want to do this, put it at X distance from the flames. So this one really speaks to a lot of interesting aspects of the cuisine at the time.
Okay, I want to ask you about more food. Are there any techniques, or I should say, are there any ingredients that simply we don't use anymore at all, that have sort of vanished, that were main staples in that book that sort of caught you by surprise?
Staples, not really. And of course, an important element here is that this cuisine, of course, predates the so-called Columbian Exchange. So there's no New World produce. There's no potatoes, no tomatoes, no chilies, no nothing. But yet it was a very seasoned cuisine. In terms of ingredient, I would say it's the combination of spices that jumps out. In terms of vegetables, for instance, I'm trying to think now. The vegetables that are used by Tujibi, for instance, I would say that probably 4 or 5 vegetables occur in 2/3 of the recipe. You know, things like onion, aubergine, a particular favorite, chickpeas, both of which, of course, we also find in Eastern cuisine, broad beans, and perhaps more surprisingly, gourd. Those are kind of the top 5. In terms of spices, as I said, it's the salt, pepper, mint, coriander. Those are kind of the big ones. It's the combinations, for instance, and the use in particular dishes that would be more surprising. The fact that, for instance, pepper is used in sweets. The fact that a dish is kind of rounded with a sprinkling of, say, pepper and spikenard. Spikenard is perhaps a good spice to mention, which Pardon?
What is spikenard?
Well, spikenard is a very aromatic spice. It's a root in Arabic, sunbun.
Okay.
And very fragrant, very expensive at the time. And it's really a spice that I use now at home in dishes quite frequently. Then we have, in terms of ingredients that no longer exist, Tujibi has one that is mentioned only by him, and it's a zanbour. And the zanbour is somewhat mysterious. Would take us too far to explain the very convoluted ways in which I've arrived at my final decision, but I translated it as a pomelo.
Okay.
So in any case, it's a kind of citrus fruit. They were very partial to citrus fruit, so lemons, limes, something that we incidentally also find still in Moroccan cuisine, where they use preserved lemons. If you've ever had a Moroccan tagine, it's one of the kind of staple ingredients. Um, the other thing, perhaps, that one might be surprised at is the relatively low frequency of rice in the cuisine. But once again, if you think about it a bit more, it's not that surprising. The reason why anybody today would be surprised, of course, is because most people outside of Spain, if you ask them, what is the quintessentially Spanish dish, they will all say paella.
Yeah.
Now, even today in Spain, of course, paella is really the dish of the Valencia region. And there's a reason for that. It is that rice was grown only in a relatively small area. So that explains why there's quite a few rice dishes in Andalusian cuisine. So it's only dishes that come from that particular region.
Super interesting. Okay, I have lots of questions. The first question, I want to talk about the Columbian Exchange. So when that happened, right? So the arrival of all these produce from the New World, the tomatoes and the potatoes, I think, being the most influential. When those became introduced, did they take over? Did they replace certain ingredients in existing dishes, or did they birth new dishes altogether?
Well, I wish I had the answer to that, but the Arabic culinary tradition, textual history there, ends in the 15th century, just before the Columbian Exchange, the New World Produce kicks in. These are large questions. I can only speculate. Firstly, of course, it has to be said that when we say it stopped, it means that there are no known texts between the 15th and the 19th century. So in the 19th century, we have the first printed Arabic cookery book, but they are of a completely different type. They are cookery books that have more in common with Western elite dining, Western French elite dining than medieval Arab. So what happened in the meantime? Well, one can speculate that, remember, these cookery books were written or reflected the elite cuisine, the elite dining experience and practices. Now, the 15th century, of course, is a very important period because we are seeing, of course, the Ottomans. And the Ottomans in the early 16th century, of course, they take control, and the center of power, the place where an elite chef would find employment, where he would find a generous patron, was no longer Tunis or Cairo or Baghdad, but it was Istanbul. And so the center of power, the balance of power shifted, and with it, this elite cuisine and the attention to the elite cuisine. But it's not as if the Arabic culinary tradition disappeared without a trace, because Ottoman cuisine, the oldest Ottoman cookery book, is actually a translation of an Arabic cookery book by a man called al-Katib al-Baghdadi from the 13th century, late 13th century. And the British Library actually has a copy of the manuscript, gold embossed and everything, that once was given as a present to the Ottoman Sultan. So this tells us although the culinary writing genre wasn't considered literature, it was considered very important. And of course, this goes back even to Abbasid times, where we have caliphs and scholars. You mentioned the Sultan's sex potions. We have Tusi, the great astronomer, some say the greatest astronomer of the Middle Ages, who also apparently did a cookery book, and of course also wrote the book on aphrodisiac, the Sultan's sex potions. And so Ottoman cuisine developed out of that. And of course, it acquired another identity, not least because it was also subject to other influences, particularly Turkic influences in terms of the use of, say, pasta, use of dough, and so on and so forth. To get back to your question about what happened afterwards, so that we have 5 centuries, of which we know very little. So there's no cookery books. They no doubt are hiding in some archive or library. And so it's very difficult to gauge when ingredients actually were introduced and how they changed dishes. And I was reminded of that only last year when somebody brought to my attention a book that was written in the 19th century. And it was written, if memory serves, in northern Syria. I would have to check the reference. But anyway, this person told me that that book referred to the potato as being a novelty. So now, of course, this is very anecdotal. And as I said, I haven't seen the source myself, but it doesn't strike me as being impossible either. But so it's really not known when for instance, when was the tomato first used in dishes in the Arab world? So there's a number. So there's really half a millennium about which there's no Arabic recipe collections that are known. And so we don't know to what extent, when, where, because that would also be extremely interesting to see where these New World products were introduced first, how it spread. Because, you know, one thing about food that's so fascinating is the mobility of dishes and ingredients.
Yeah.
So it would have been very interesting to find out. But yes, unfortunately, there's no answer, at least for the time being, to that question.
Okay, I want to ask you about seafood. You had mentioned paella, and when I personally think about like Tunis, for example, I think of tuna. They eat a lot of tuna.
Yeah.
And on the website, on your Instagram, there's a really interesting dried tuna recipe that almost looks like beef jerky. It's like a jerky. Yeah. And then there's this medieval fried shrimp dish. Talk to me about how fish was being prepared, how seafood was being prepared at the time, and how that compares to today.
First of all, we have to ask ourselves, what was the status of fish / seafood? And that's an important element, because, of course, remember, we're talking about an elite cuisine. Whereas in the Byzantine Empire, seafood was highly prized. The same wasn't really true in the medieval Arabic tradition. And sorry, I thought, because I had a little wheel again, I thought you were going to go off. And in the Near Eastern manuals, for instance, there's really not that much use of fresh fish, as in fish dishes. Of course, people were eating fish, but it wasn't really the most prized. Meat was king. In al-Andalus, we have a different picture. Their fish is quite important. And Al-Tujibi's collection is really unique. It is the only one that has tuna recipes, and quite a few of them. Not just tuna recipes, but both fresh and dried. And it's the dried one, of course, that is so unusual to us. And indeed, it looks and feels like jerky. So you need to dry it out. Of course, I use an air dryer because there's no sun where I live. There's barely daylight. And then that's, pardon?
No, just funny. Yeah. It's trying to recreate a Southern Mediterranean cuisine in places without daylight.
Indeed, especially if it says, and now dry it in the sun for 10 days. If I can find 2 days in a row in summer, I consider myself lucky. So fish in Andalusian cuisine, another, I would say, important marker. And for Al-Tujibi, the use of tuna, and there's quite a few recipes. When it comes to shrimp, we're again in an interesting place. Shrimp were used in a paste in the Mashriq, so in the Near East. And there is a recipe for a kind of shrimp samosa in the earliest Abbasid tradition. Al-Tujibi, again, has a recipe for fried shrimp, which is a very nice recipe. And I actually used shrimp from Spain, from the area that he was recommending. That was rather unusual. So they weren't really given to. Incidentally, he also has a recipe for grasshoppers. Another unusual recipe.
Do you think at any point, Daniel, he was just adding random things, or do you think these were like the standard recipes? Do you think he was just having fun with it?
Well, it's something in between. I mean, whether this was standard, I would say no. I don't think he was as much of a prankster as you appear to be. So he wouldn't have thrown in one. But I think I have to go back to our earlier discussion that this is really an anthology. And I mean, my word, there's some wonderful recipes where, animals inside animals and so on. One called al-Kamil, the complete one. And so there's quite a few recipes that I think maybe he would never even have tasted and definitely not have made. He mentions at the outset that these are dishes that he collected, but also dishes that he made and some that he invented. Unfortunately, he doesn't really tell us which. So he doesn't really tell us, oh, this is a dish that I've invented. But so you're absolutely right. They notion that every single one of those dishes would have been eaten at the time. I think that's a little bit far-fetched.
Yeah. I have another question about influence. When a cookbook comes out today, part of oftentimes the stated goal of the publication is to preserve these dishes, to evangelize for these dishes, to spread these dishes, to get people to try them, to influence local culture and local cuisine, and get people to actually incorporate these into their daily lives and have them be part of their modern day kitchens and tables. Was he interested in that at all? Is there any evidence that this shaped North African cuisine as much as it preserved and represented Andalusian cuisine?
That's a very broad question, and one that's one has to be very careful about answering. he definitely thought that the Andalusian cuisine was one of the best cuisines around. And in addition to preserving this heritage, I'm sure there was an element of trying to spread the news of Andalusian food and establish its reputation. When it comes to the influence of the book, I would contrast that with the influence of Andalusian cuisine, which came with the Andalusian refugees and exiles. I think that's probably a much more sensible way of looking at it. And here we have some interesting data. In the 15th century, there's an Egyptian traveler who arrives in Tunis. And he reports that he was invited to a formal dinner by the leading lights of the Andalusian trading community. Now, the Andalusians that went to North Africa, that's a whole different story. And they, particularly in Tunis, they were very active in trade as well as artisanal pursuits. And so their influence, the influence of Andalusians on Tunisian society and on the economy, in fact, was quite significant. And we see, for instance, going back to the story of our 15th century Egyptian, he describes how at that dinner, they make a dish which they, the Andalusians, call mujabbana, which is essentially fried cheese bun. And he says that the head of the trading community, the merchant community, he and some of his colleagues prepared this in front of the guests. Now, this is a crucial, I think, piece of information, because this tells us really that the mujabbana was already considered to be profoundly Andalusian, and that this was something that was endowed with particular significance as an item of heritage, which explains why it wasn't just made by the cook in the kitchen and brought in. No, it was made by the master of the house. When it comes to the cookery book, we have some evidence of at least, or the suspicion of an influence that lasts until the present day. In Al-Tujibi's book, we also have the oldest recipe for a makrud. The makrud, of course, very apt that we should talk about it today because it's one of the favorite Ramadan sweets. Makrud, I'm sure you've had it, of course. That's a pastry filled with dates, syrup, and so on. And so the makrud is already mentioned at Tujibi, who has a couple of variants. He has one that's kind of filled with sugar and nuts, and then another one filled with dates. Another one, since we're talking about Ramadan in Tunis, we also have the makharib, which today is similar to a makrud, but it's slightly longer. It has holes in the middle. And that also existed, although in Tujibi's time, the recipe is a variant of a tharid. But so we also have things like the zalabiya, we already have in Tujibi. So there's proof of historical lineage, but I would be very reluctant to try and pin that on one book, because I think the Andalusians would have made a number of those dishes. And of course, we can't exclude either that some of those dishes would have been part of the native North African heritage already. So Tujibi mentioned couscous, but couscous was not invented by Tujibi. Couscous is originally a Berber, an Amazigh dish.
Yeah.
So there's all these different strands that one has to take into account. But what I can say is that there are a number of dishes that can actually be traced back over the centuries, in addition to certain ways of cooking.
Okay, one last question to try to wrap up the conversation. You'd mentioned that Tujibi thought very highly of Andalusian food. I'm curious, at the time, were there other cuisines regionally adjacent to Andalusia or to North Africa that had very good reputations? That people thought, you must try Greek food. Greek food is known to be the pinnacle of cuisine. Did other regions have good reputations, or did everyone just think their food was the best?
I think it's probably the latter. There are references. Yes, it's easy to see how things have changed over the millennia. Not at all.
Yeah.
There are people were aware, though. This is quite significant. People were aware of certain tastes, local tastes. So there are references to, for instance, this is the kind of food that people in Egypt would like, or that people in Iraq would like, or this is a dish that people in Tunis would like, but other nations might not go for that. But so there's no cuisine that they would probably, one thing that is probably true to say is that they would have looked eastward like with so many things. So and Al-Tujibi has a number of dishes that he lists as being Eastern, and so we have a number of the even Abbasid classics that made their way to al-Andalus, sometimes retaining both the name and the preparation, other times retaining the preparation but with a different name. A typical example is the so-called white stew, the isfi the beige, which the original one would have used cheese, hence the color, which in Al-Andalus became tafaya, allegedly introduced by this very famous character Ziryab. And then there were dishes from the East that were introduced that retained their name, but were given an Andalusian twist. And there are a number of examples. Two that I'd like to mention. One is the tharid. The tharid, of course, which is basically just shredded bread in a sauce with vegetables and meat. Very old dish. In fact, it's one of the dishes considered the favorite of the Prophet Muhammad. In the East, there's really not that many tharid dishes, recipes, because it was considered not really food for the elite. In Al-Andalus, on the other hand, the tharid really got a new lease of life. And there are many recipes for many different types of tharid. So the tharid, from a peasant dish, was turned into an elite dish. The other example is one that I've just actually finished a recreation of the judaba. It is my favorite dish from the medieval Arab culinary tradition. In the East, it's a drip pudding, chicken over flatbreads. In between, there would be fruit. And so the juices of the roasting chicken would infuse these flatbreads and turn it into a cake. It's a wonderful dish. I know it may not sound appetizing. But the Andalusian variety, there are two. One where it becomes a straightforward cake, of course, very sugary, very nutty, very aromatic. And there's another variety where the chicken is no longer suspended above the breads, the flatbreads, the ruqaq, but it's buried inside of it. So you have different layers of ruqaq. That's the one I recreate. I will post very shortly on Instagram, with a sugar in between the layers of ruqaq, and then the chicken inside, and then you fold it up and you bake it. It's one example of a dish that somebody from the East would not have recognized.
Yeah. Okay, I lied. I said that was my last question. I have another question. At the time, maybe you're going to be able to answer this question or not, I'm not sure, but what was food culture like at the time? Can you glean what food culture was like at the time? Did people talk and care about food in a way that's at all reminiscent to the way we are today? I mean, you just mentioned it. You said, I'm going to upload this on Instagram, right? People are buying books about food from 800 years ago. They're subscribed to Instagram accounts. People describe themselves with the noun. I am a foodie. It's like an identifier. At the time, did people care about food in any similar way?
Some people most definitely did. And we have evidence. I told you rulers and scholars were composing recipe collections, were cooking themselves. Ibrahim bin al-Mahdi was a famous, was not just a gastronome, but also a chef. There's a very significant literary genre of culinary poetry. So people, yes, absolutely, they talked about food, they composed poems about food. My word, some of them were obsessed with food, much more even than foodies today. So absolutely, it was very important. And of course, we haven't even touched on, and that's there's no time for, but of course, it was also linked to medicine. So
Yeah.
in terms of which, if food was important as a sensory and a sensory delight, but also important for one's health. So yes, absolutely, you have. Ibrahim bin al-Mahdi is really somebody that I would have loved to spend an evening with. Not only would he have been a lot of fun, but yes, my word, I mean, some of these people were, one could even say, obsessed with food. And if you read the chronicle by al-Mas'udi, there are many stories about the great rulers, particularly Abbasid, of course, and food. How they organized a dinner and how they judged food.
Yeah.
So think of how somebody might talk about wine. So one could even say that some of them might be considered today to be somewhat of a food bore.
So fun. Well, the book is the Exiles Cookbook, Medieval Gastronomic Treasures from Al-Andalus and North Africa. I highly recommend going to eatlikeasultan.com to see Daniel's blog and checking out his Instagram. Daniel, this was so much fun. Thank you for coming back. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great fun. Thank you.